All right, you guys. So today we are I was going to try and kind of go through this PowerPoint a little bit with you guys to kind of help explain some of the things that you guys read about in your packet that I sent home last week. So as you can see, this is going to be about the 1950s in the United States. All right. So when we come out of World War II and we start looking at the Cold War, this is a really important step that you guys need to understand before we got to the Cold War conversation that I kind of sent home in that packet with you. So we're going to either decide if the 1950s is all about conservatism, complacency, and contentment, meaning that everything's fine, we're good, everything's totally going great, it's awesome, or if it's anxiety, alienation, and social unrest. Okay, so this period of time, this decade, can be either seen as like this really prim and proper, perfect world, or it's a huge, just kind of crazy time where people aren't really sure what they're doing, what they want. There's a lot of fights and arguments over certain things. The Cold War is kind of amping up and getting more and more serious. So there's a lot of kind of discrepancy over whether the 1950s are a good thing or a bad thing. Okay, so the first thing is the baby boom. All right, a few of you may have heard of this, but the baby boom is basically at the time after the soldiers got home from World War II, when they came home and they were able to see their girlfriends and their wives again. And then, a lot of people came back from the war, and then there was a lot of babies that were being born because they were, gone for so long fighting off in this war. And this British visitor to America in 1958 said, "It seems to me that every other young housewife I see is pregnant." So it's like almost everybody at this time was pregnant. So if you guys can see in this graph, you can see right here, if you see my mouse, these years, 1946 to 1950 and 1951 to 1955, these are the highest birth rate years in the United States. Okay, so these really just skyrocket after the fact of 1941 to 1945 of the United States being in the war. Okay, so the baby boom helps the 1950s a lot. Okay, so down here it says in 1957 there was one baby born every 7 seconds. Okay, so that's how many we're talking about in reality. Okay, one baby was born every 7 seconds. Okay, so it's very, very rapid. There's a lot of babies being born. So this is a picture of Dr. Benjamin Spock and the Anderson quintuplets. Okay, so this is like one of the very first cases that we've seen of quintuplets. What that means is there's 6 babies born at the very same time. Okay, and then again, you guys can see if this is school enrollment. Okay, it skyrockets as soon as these babies get old enough to go into school. This steadily starts to grow because you can see how many children are actually in the baby boom. Excuse me. Okay, so another section of 1950s life is suburban living. Okay, this is where the whole American dream ideal comes into play. All right, this is where you can go from rags to riches, and everything's possible in America, and it's going to be great, and all this other stuff. Okay, so it's in 1949 where William Levitt produced 150 houses per week. So that means that suburbs and housing developments and cul-de-sacs and things like that are popping up very, very quickly. So there's 150 houses per week that are built. That's where we kind of get the cookie cutter homes who they all look very similar. They all look almost exactly alike. And that's how they were able to get built so quickly, is because they would just build basically the same house over and over and over again. Then they would just change a few things here and there. And then the American families were able to just kind of slide right in there very quickly. So that adds to it. So that's where we get to a situation like this, where it's a huge cul-de-sac like what we see in today. And so the payment for a house back in those days, if you could believe it, there was a $7,990 for the house, or a $60 a month payment. So their mortgages back then were $60 a month. Now, granted, you guys got to remember that that would be a lot more in today's money, but for that, it kind of looks pretty good to only have a $60 house payment. Okay, so now we come to the new American dream. Okay, so a part of this American dream was having that perfect kind of Leave It to Beaver house. Okay, the perfect house that every American wanted was a 1-story high. There was a 12 by 19 feet living room. There's 2 bedrooms, a tiled bathroom, a garage, a small backyard, a front lawn, a white picket fence out front. You know, that's like the typical house that you were seeing in this suburban American dream. All right. So by 1960, a third of the U.S. population had moved to suburbs. So suburbs were a huge part of the United States culture in the 1950s and going into the 1960s. Okay. So after World War II, like what we had just finished talking about, these people are moving steadily from the cities out into the suburbs. Okay. And trying to find this perfect kind of new American dream style house, right? So here we've it just shows us the shift in population distribution from 1940 to 1970. So this is showing how steadily the suburb area is growing. Okay, so in this first row, we have central cities. So this is showing you how many people were going or what percentage of the population lived within central cities or rural areas or suburbs. So if you go from 1940 all the way up to 1970, you can steadily see that the suburbs population is growing and growing and growing, whereas, you know, central cities stays about the same and the rural areas and towns starts to really drop. So that means that people are moving more steadily from small towns into suburbs and or coming from the cities into the suburbs. So suburbs are getting a lot more popular and kind of are becoming a real like staple of American society in the 1950s. All right, so now we've got the typical TV suburban family. So these are like the models that would be on the television for people that were in the United States. And this is actually a picture off to the side of what a TV would have looked like back then. So this is actually a real life thing. This is what TVs kind of looked like back then. And every week they would have shows come in, and it would be like perfect examples of these perfect American families that you're trying to basically you're looking up to, you're trying to be like. Okay, so the first one we've got here is the Donna Reed Show. Okay, that was on from 1958 to 1966. Then we've got Leave It to Beaver, like I mentioned a second ago. We got Leave It to Beaver from 1957 and 1963. Father Knows Best from 1954 to 1958, and the Ozzie and Harriet Show from 52 to 66. Okay, so these are kind of like the shows that everyday Americans are sitting down in their living rooms and watching, and they're seeing this as like their example of what a perfect family life is, or what kind of like what the American dream is like, what it should look like, stuff like that. Okay. So along with this, a new big thing in America during this time is something called consumerism. Basically, that means there are a lot of people that have a lot of money and they're going out and they're buying stuff. Okay. So in 1950, this is the introduction of the diner's card. Okay. So this really introduces consumer credit. That means that you can buy something on a credit card or on a credit account, and you won't have to pay it until the end of the month or until the 90 days are up, or whatever the deal is that the company is trying to give you. So that means that if you want a new washer and dryer or a new toaster or a new vacuum, and you don't necessarily have the money right now to get it, but you will in a month or 2 months or 3 months, you can still go get that vacuum cleaner or toaster or washer and dryer and just buy it on credit. So this steadily just skyrockets after we get out of World War II. More and more people are going out and they're buying things on credit. They're getting bigger and better products. Okay. So this quote down here, it says, all babies were potential consumers who spearheaded a brand new market for food, clothing, and shelter. So it was during this time that because of the baby boom, people were going out and then they're moving into the suburbs and all this other stuff. The 50s is a huge time of appearances. We're trying to make ourselves look better than everyone else. We're trying to make ourselves look like those perfect American families that we saw in those TV shows. So that means you need to go out and you need to get the better washer and the better dryer and the better vacuum and the better car, and maybe your family will have two cars instead of just one car, or it'll have a really nice refrigerator or whatever. And it's the stereotypical keeping up with the Joneses type mantra of we have to kind of be better than everybody else, right? So these are just kind of some of the ads that would come up, all right? So there's this one right here. This is the Iron Curtain look is here. So that's kind of talking about the Soviet Union and the Cold War right there. And then we've got Tupperware, the promise of plastic in 1950s America. We've got a picture of a radio off to the side. We've got the black Baylight television. It's a General Electric TV that they're trying to sell. Okay, so these are the ads that are coming out to people either over the radio, in magazines, on the television, in newspapers, stuff like that. Okay, so along with the consumerism, a big part of that we have to look at is the fact that the workplace is changing. So without having enough money, these people wouldn't have the ability to go and be these great consumers that they are. So the workplace is a huge piece of the consumer piece. Okay, so automation is extremely important when it comes to the 1950s. Okay, so from 1947 to 1957, factory workers decreased by 4.3%, eliminating 1.5 million blue-collar jobs. Okay, so blue-collar jobs is like a plumber or a carpenter or a factory worker or a mechanic, stuff like that. That's like more hands-on. Okay, by 1956, more white-collar jobs than blue-collar jobs were in the United States. A white-collar job is like an office worker or accountant or someone who works at a bank, or kind of like just a desk job type thing, or like a doctor or a lawyer and all that other stuff. Okay, and then computers come into play. So we've got the Mark I, which is built in 1944, excuse me. And then we've got the first IBM mainframe computer, which came out in 1951. Okay, so that's kind of boosting workplace productivity. Then we've got corporate consolidation. All right, what that means is by 1960, 600 corporations, which is 1/2% of all U.S. companies, accounted for 53% of total corporate income. Okay, the question here is why did 600 corporations? So that means 600 businesses made up of over half of the corporate income. Okay, the reason why is because of the fact that we are looking at the Cold War military buildup. A lot of these corporations are helping to promote Cold War military buildup. So that it means that we've kind of got over half of our corporate output or our corporate money-making power is going towards military buildup, if that makes any sense. Okay, so we've got the new corporate culture. Okay, so this leads to the quote company man. Okay, so an example of this is 1956 Sloan Wilson's The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. So stereotypically, if you see videos or movies that are set in the 1950s, this is kind of the typical man that you would see. You know, he's in his gray flannel suit, he's got his top hat on, he's got a tie, He's going off to his office job that he's going to make his money to provide for his family. And this is kind of the new image that's coming out in the 1950s. Now, in the 40s and 30s, you saw the working man or the factory worker more often than not. But in the 50s, it was the businessman. Okay. He was the company man. He was working his kind of tail off to provide for his family. And he was going to work every day with his briefcase and his gray flannel suit. Okay. So this is kind of the image of the everyday man that was in the 1950s. All right, so now we get to cars. So, and if there's any car guys out there, car girls, you guys will be interested in this point because this is when muscle cars and that type of culture really takes off. Okay, so at this point in 1945, car registrations, that means people who actually own a car, was only at about 25 million. So only about 25 million people owned cars. By 1960, that number had skyrocketed to 60 million people owning cars. Okay, so two family cars doubles from 1951 to 1958. What that means is stereotypically before the 1950s, a family of just an average family would only have one car. Well, in the 50s, we were booming. Our economy was booming enough, and that we were able to buy on credit and all that other stuff, that families more typically were able to buy more than one car. So that means the dad could use the car to drive to work, and then the mom, while she was at home, could go pick up the kids or go grocery shopping or whatever with her own car. So each of them would have their own car. Okay, so now we're looking at some of the famous cars that are coming into play. So we've got the 1958 pink Cadillac and the 1959 Chevy Corvette. Okay, these are kind of not even kind of, these are the top sellingest cars of the 1950s, and they're the most famous. So we always see a pink Cadillac with the big fins on the back and the Chevy Corvette. Okay. By 1956, we had enacted the Interstate Highway Act, which is the largest public works project in American history. Okay. It cost $32 billion. And in this, we built 41,000 miles of new highways. Okay. So that means any type of interstate, which an interstate highway is where it will travel through more than one state. So if you go on I-75 or Interstate 71 or any of those highways, those are the highways that we're talking about. Okay. Those are the places you can use to travel all over the country, or even like turnpikes and stuff like that. America became a more homogenous nation because of the automobile. Okay, so basically that means that they're building their kind of their identity around this automobile. They're becoming more homogenous. That means more similar. They're out doing things. They're going to the first McDonald's that was built in 1955. They're driving out to Howard Johnson's. They're going to the drive-in movies. It's just kind of like it seems like a really good time because everybody's kind of out and about. They're buying things. They're introducing new things. They're coming up with new ideas, things like that. Okay. The US population was on the move in the 1950s. So people were going from the Northeast and the Midwest to the South or the Southwest, to especially the Sun Belt states. Okay. It was in 1955 when Disneyland opened in Southern California, and 40% of the guests came from outside California, and they got there by car. Okay. So again, this is 1950s. They're coming in, and everybody's trying to get this experience, and they're getting there by these interstates that were built across the nation. So we've got Frontierland there, we've got Main Street in Disneyland, and we have Tomorrowland that these people were going to see. And we're so excited to experience this Disneyland type place. All right, so now we've got to television. Okay. In 1946, 7,000 TV sets were in the United States. By 1950, 50 million TV sets were in the United States. Okay. Television is a vast wasteland, which is Newton Minow, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission in 1961. Okay. The mass audience were directed towards TV that celebrated traditional American values. So, like those TV shows that I brought up, the Leave It to Beaver or The Father Knows Best or anything like that. We've got things like Superman, which is truth, justice, and the American way. All right, so we're looking at those type of shows. Okay, so the next thing that we're looking at is the Westerns. All right. If you have ever had your grandpa or anybody in your family talk about the Westerns back in the day, these are what we're talking about. So we've got Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, the Lone Ranger and his faithful sidekick Tonto, and Sheriff Matt Dillon in Gunsmoke. Okay, so these are the kind of famous people that we're talking about, the cowboys of the West. Now we've got the family shows. Okay, the family shows are this glossy view of mostly middle-class suburban life. So this is what that means is they're kind of promoting this perfect way of life. And, you got to kind of live up to this reputation of being perfect and looking perfect, and you don't ever have any problems, and you're husband and wife, but you sleep in the separate beds, and you have babies, but you don't necessarily show that you're pregnant or anything like that. And you don't talk about those things, and you only talk about happy things. You don't cry in front of people or get angry or cause any type of a scene or anything like that. It's all this glossy, very beautiful type of shows. So this leads to kind of I Love Lucy and shows like The Honeymooners. Okay, so I Love Lucy is more on the side of it's this perfect middle-class suburban family. It's a mom and a dad, and they're in love, and then they end up having little Ricky, and it's just, they're great. But then there's also the Honeymooners, which is kind of on the lower class of American life. And I believe the husband is a cop and the wife is a housewife, but they don't necessarily get along. And they're kind of always fighting. And that's kind of the shtick of the Honeymooners. That's that they kind of fight a lot, but they still love each other. So they're kind of asking this question of who is the social winner and who's the losers if they look happy and are happy on TV, but if they're also fighting all the time, what's the goal that we're looking for? And this also, and this we've also got teen culture. So in the 1950s, the word teenager entered the American language. No one had ever called anyone that is your guys' age a teenager before. This is actually coming into play in the 1950s. By 1956, about 13 million teenagers with a $7 bill all right, there was 13 million teenagers with about $7 billion to spend a year. Okay. That doesn't mean that each teenager had $7 billion. That just means those 13 billion teens all of them had about $7 billion to spend. And it was in 1951 that, quote, race music or rock and roll came out. And that's where we kind of got the music that was in the background of this, where it was Elvis Presley came out, and it was huge. Okay. This is a huge time for Elvis Presley. And he kind of changed the game, and he made it so that predominantly what people would call African American music kind of came into the realm of white music. All right. Because remember, at this time in the 50s, that we are still segregated as a country. So the Elvis was kind of a big deal in the fact that he was kind of blending and blurring those lines a little bit. Next thing is juvenile delinquency. Okay. Juvenile delinquency was a big thing in the 1950s. Basically, juvenile delinquency is if you have a kid that kind of breaks the rules or goes against the grain or is kind of a troublemaker, he's a juvenile delinquent. All right. So in 1951, we've got J.D. Salinger's A Catcher in the Rye. And we've got Marlon Brando in The Wild One, and James Dean in A Rebel Without a Cause. Okay, so these are the kind of greaser types that if you guys have ever seen the movie Grease or Hairspray or anything like that, where it's like they are the people that go against the grain. They're kind of like the bad boy or the kind of rebels that are coming into play, where they're most generally from the lower end of society. They like to break the rules, and they got their leather jackets and their motorcycles and their slick back hair. And that kind of comes into a huge play in teen culture. Okay. Now we've got the beat generation. Okay. We've got Jack Kerouac, who's on the road, Allen Ginsberg, who writes the poem Howl, Neil Cassidy, and William S. Burroughs. A beatnik is somebody who kind of uh, is a little bit on the dirtier side, who's kind of out there, a little funny. And then we've got the clean teen, who's kind of like a square, who's a prude, who follows all the rules, who who does everything by the book, who follows everything, has a certain idea of what they should do. They're kind of from the upper class. They kind of think they're better than everybody else, stuff like that. Okay, so we've kind of got the beatnik and the clean teen. Those are the two uh, kind of characteristics of teen culture. Now we've got behavioral rules of the 1950s. I know you guys will love to hear these. Okay, first thing, we've got to obey authority. It is expected of teenagers to obey authority. We control our emotions. You don't get upset, you don't cry, you don't throw a fit, make a scene, anything like that. You need to control your emotions. You don't make waves. You fit into the group. Okay, you don't stand out. You're not different. You fit into the group. And then at this time, don't even think about sex with 3 exclamation points. Those are the behavioral rules that were expected of teens in the 1950s. Okay. Part of that, part of the reason why we have all these rules is this religious revival that comes through the 1950s. All right. Today in the U.S., the Christian faith is back in the center of things. That's from Time Magazine in 1954. So again, you can see the increase in church numbers. From 1940, we've got about 64 million people going, and by the 1960s, we've got 114 million people. So that grows exponentially. At the same time, we have a growth of television preachers. So that means preachers that would just kind of, you would go to church in your living room by watching TV. Okay, this means Catholic Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, which is Life is Worth Living. A Methodist minister, Norman Vincent Peale, which is The Power of Positive Thinking, and Reverend Billy Graham, who was an ecumenical message warned against the evils of communism. Okay, so again, communism is kind of a background noise, or it's kind of going on all in the background during this entire time, which is going to come up later in this PowerPoint. But at this time, church is kind of becoming a huge thing because people are scared about the Cold War. They're kind of, they want answers. They want something to look forward to if things do go bad, because at this point, we're talking about nuclear war. Okay. Nuclear war is not, is not good for people at this point in time. Okay. It's also during this that Hollywood was the apex of biblical epics. That means that they're going out and making these hugely popular biblical-esque movies that are based on different parts of the Bible. So we've got The Robe in 1953, The Ten Commandments in 1956, and Ben-Hur in 1959. And these are still some of the most famous Hollywood epics of all time. And this quote says, "It's un-American to be unreligious," the Christian century of 1954. So now what I need you guys to understand about the 50s is that they had a particular idea of what it is to be American. Okay, so it was, you do certain things this way, you're an American. You do it another way, and it goes against the grain, you're non-American type things. It was, they had certain defined ideals that made you an American or not. Okay. Now we're going into gender roles. Okay. So this is a quote from Life magazine in 1956. It says the ideal modern woman married, cooked, and cared for her family and kept herself busy by joining the local PTA and leading a troop of campfire girls. She entertained her guests in her family's suburban house and worked out on the trampoline to keep her size 12 figure. Okay. So that's kind of what is expected of gender roles. Okay. Then off the side, we've got Marilyn Monroe. The ideal 50s man was the provider, protector, and the boss of the house. Again, that's from Life magazine, 1955. So some examples of this is 1956, William H. Wright in The Organization Man, and a middle class white suburban man is the ideal. Again, with the briefcase off to the side and the gray flannel suit. Okay. So then we've got changing sexual behavior. So we've got Alfred Kinsey in 1948, who wrote The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and then in 1953, The Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. Premarital sex was common. Extramarital affairs were frequent among married couples. Okay, so during this time, sexual behavior, it becomes a kind of surreal thing. Like I said, man and wife were not sharing the same bed. They were sleeping separately. They, more often than not, more people were having sex before marriage. And this is kind of a changing time in the America in the 1950s. And I think that really comes back from the end of World War II and because of the fact that nuclear war is a real threat at this point. Kinsey's results are an assault on the family as a basic unit of society, a negation of moral law, and a celebration of licentiousness. Okay. Now, on top of that, the 1950s is a huge time for science. All right. So 1951, the first IBM mainframe computer is rolled out. Then 1952 is the hydrogen bomb test. Then it's the DNA structure discovered in 1953. Then there's the Salk vaccine tested for polio in 1954. 1957, the first commercial U.S. nuclear power plant is created. 1958, NASA is created. And then in 1959, the press conference for the first 7 American astronauts is put into place. Okay. 1957, on the same side of this, the Russians launch Sputnik the first. So during this time, there's a real arms race, both for military weapons, and then there's a space race. So the space race is a race between the Americans and between the Russians on who can get to space first, who can send a human being into space and then get them back on Earth as safely as possible. Okay, so it was in 1957 that the Russians were able to launch Sputnik, and it kind of really put Americans in gear to try and get the first American launched into space before the Russians could. Okay, the Soviet fires Earth's satellites into space. It is circling the globe at 18,000 miles per hour, sphere tracked in 4 crossings over the U.S. All right, so then we've got Sputnik sitting there for you guys to see. In 1958, this also is the time where the National Defense Education Act comes out. Okay. Again, UFO sightings skyrocketed in the 1950s. This is where we get movies like Amazing Forbidden Planet, Invaders from Mars, and War of the Worlds. Okay, so again, the ideas of kind of restrictive, I guess, thought processes is kind of going out of the scope. Okay, we are huge on religious type things. We are huge on UFO and space research. We are huge on technology and trying to up our technology and what we can have in our homes and both in our businesses. And then we're also huge on changing those gender roles or making sure that they stay the same on either side. And Hollywood used aliens as a metaphor for whom, do you think? Okay, since the Russians made it to space first, Hollywood most generally are using aliens in these movies as a metaphor for the Soviet Union or for those Russian communists. In this time, they also have atomic anxieties. Okay, this is where we come from the duck and cover generation. Okay, so as you can see off to the side, there are students doing the duck and cover drills to try and protect themselves from atomic attacks. Obviously, this is not going to work. An atomic bomb will not protect you from an atomic bomb. But in this time, atomic testing is skyrocketing. 1946 to 1962, the U.S. exploded 217 nuclear weapons over the Pacific and in Nevada. Okay, so down here in these pictures, you can see that there's a fallout shelter mentioned. It shows a family kind of preparing themselves in their nuclear shelter. At this time, people thought that it was going to happen, that the atomic bombs were going to be dropped, because at this time, more than just the United States had atomic bombs. And after we saw what could happen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States was kind of intimidated and worried at the fact of we might be attacked by the Russians if they decided to drop a nuclear bomb on us, and we needed to be prepared. Okay. So at this time, the 1950s come to a close with this. In 1959, President Nixon and Khrushchev from the Soviet Union have the kitchen debate. Okay, as seen here, that this guy off to the side, this is Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, and this is Richard Nixon. And they're going through this. The Cold War tensions explode into technology and affluence. Excuse me. So we've got kind of Cold War tensions on one side and the developing technology and kind of the hoity-toityness of the world. Okay. So in this, it's just kind of a discussion topic that I kind of want you guys to throw around in your brain a little bit. You don't have to do anything, write anything down or anything like that, but kind of just chew on it a little bit and it's a little food for thought. It says the post-war era witnessed tremendous economic growth and rising social contentment and conformity. Yet, in the midst of such increasing affluence and comfortable domesticity, social critics expressed a growing sense of unease with American culture in the 1950s. So it's kind of saying, even though we have tremendous economic growth, meaning we have a lot of money, we're out there buying a lot of things, and there are a lot of people that are happy and conforming to this American ideal, we also have a lot of unease. There's a lot of time where there's people arguing about what is right and what is wrong, and there are people scared about the atomic bombs and all this other things. So they're saying kind of assess the validity or how valid that statement is, and explain how the decade of the 1950s laid the groundwork for the social and political turbulence of the 1960s. So just kind of take a second to think about, you don't have to write anything down. You don't have to send me anything or anything like that. Don't write anything down. Just think about in your head, why do you think, what are some things that could have went wrong in the 1950s that could lead to the social and political turbulence of the 1960s? So go ahead and kind of chew on that for a little bit. And I guess have a great rest of your day, you guys. I miss you. I hope you found that interesting. If not, I apologize. But yeah, that's about it.